Good afternoon. My name is Bob Glasser, and I'm the president of the Associated Students of UCLA. I'd like to welcome you to the initial program of the Associated Student Speaker Program and introduce to you Mr. Roger Howard, who is the chairman of that program.
Welcome to the first in a series of noon lectures to be sponsored by the Associated Student Speakers Program. It is a distinct honor to have Senator Wayne Morse as our first speaker. Senator Morse has distinguished himself in foreign policy and educational programs and has helped play a major role in shaping policy in the United States Senate. He is a man who has the courage of his convictions and has not been afraid to cross party lines for what he thought was right and just. He has not chosen the path of least resistance, but rather has spoken out on the vital issues of our time. It gives me great pleasure to present to you the senior senator from Oregon, the Honorable Senator Wayne Morse.
Mr. Chairman, and fellow students. And I say fellow students because my 21 years of teaching in college classrooms across this country, 15 in my own state. And as the dean of the law school, I used to say to a new faculty appointee, remember, I didn't bring you out to Oregon to teach law. I brought you out to Oregon to study and learn law with your students. For the test of a teacher is whether or not he continues to be a student. And therefore I address you this afternoon as fellow students because my job in the Senate is to continue to try to be a student. And the obligation that I owe the people of my state and my nation is to follow where the facts lead as I find those facts, testing those facts against the question, what do they seem to show the public interest to be? And when I have an answer to that question, then may I say my vote is automatic. And that means that if partisan politics are not going along in the same direction with the facts, that's just too bad for partisan politics. And if I haven't demonstrated that in my 20 years in the Senate, I haven't demonstrated anything. Now I have another bias. You notice I talk about bias and not convictions. Most people's convictions are not but biases anyway. But I have another bias, and that is a bias of being willing to stand up against what may be at the given moment a galloping majority opinion. For you students of American history and political science know that very frequently a temporary majority opinion may prove to be wrong and change. But that also, may I say to you fellow students, carries with it an obligation, an intellectual obligation on the part of each one of us. And that is that we maintain a willingness to change our mind when we find that the facts are different from what we thought they were, or when new facts have developed that justify a change of opinion. I do not belong to that school of political science that thinks it's political suicide for a politician to change his mind. I remember in 1956, in August of that year, when I was a candidate for re-election, and I had no hope of being re-elected. Most of my friends agreed with me, but I took the position they were going to have to beat me because I had changed my mind, you know, in 1952 and committed an unpardonable political sin in the view of the partisan. But I had given a speech on a tax problem in the Senate. I'd worked hard on it. I thought my premises were sound. When I finished, Paul Douglas of Illinois, I think one of the 10 outstanding economists in the country and the greatest in the Congress, arose to speak on the other side of the issue. And as I listened to him, I had more and more doubt about my views. And finally, he pulled out a table setting forth statistical data that refuted everything I had said. And I said to myself, if that table is properly documented, I'm dead wrong. So I left my seat and went over next to where Paul was reading his manuscript and pulled out of the red portion the part that the table that he read, and I studied it, and I asked him to yield, and he graciously yielded, and I said, I want to thank the senator from Illinois for conducting this tax seminar for my benefit. I want him to know that from now on in, I'm on his side of this issue, and I shall vote in accordance with his position. And I went back to my seat. Paul made it easy for me to eat political crow, feathers and all, there on the floor of the Senate. But the interesting commentary is that during the next hour, 11 senators, 7 Republicans and 4 Democrats came over to my seat one by one, expressed great concern. How did I expect to be reelected and publicly admit that I was wrong about something? And the Republicans said, we want you to know, Wayne, we want you back. I love to tell that to Republican audiences in my state. I said, don't worry about me. I didn't commit political suicide. If I'm beaten, it's not because I changed my mind. It's because they'll wallpaper the state with campaign funds against me, which they did, but they didn't beat me even with their money. But I said, you know, I got a secret political weapon, of which I'm very proud. I want you never to forget that the people of my state rate second in literacy in the nation. That's my political weapon. And don't you students ever forget that, because as chairman of the subcommittee on education, may I say, and I must get onto the subject quickly or you'll think this is a filibuster, but I want to say as chairman of the subcommittee on education, that we've got to meet this educational crisis in this country by seeing to it that we provide the facilities and we provide the scholarships and the fellowships and the teachers necessary to answer the knocks on the doors by 1980 of the qualified students that are seeking admission to college, tens of thousands of which will never be able to go to college if you and I aren't willing to meet that crisis. And we've got to do everything we can to keep American public opinion enlightened. And so I speak of that bias. I turn now to the subject that your committee asked me to talk about. What more can we do to win an honorable peace in Asia? And I have in front of me a manuscript, and I raise my right hand and swear I wrote it. And that's something for a politician to say these days. In fact, I'm thinking about introducing a bill in the Senate that would revolutionize American politics more than anything I can think of. Simple little bill, just proposing that every political office holder, before he appears before an audience or on the floor of the Senate or the House or before a television camera, has to raise his right hand as I just did and swear that he wrote the speech he's about to read. Can you imagine anything more revolutionary in American politics? You ought to sit with me in the Senate and listen to senators try to read speeches that they didn't write. And you know why there's a great merit in my proposed bill. But all joshing aside, let me say to the committee and to the press, I'm not going to read the speech. The time that's been imposed upon me would make the reading of the speech impossible. I will summarize it. You can treat it as a press release. I stand on every line of it. And you, when you read the speech, may I say to the press, will find what I say on the platform completely covers the major tenets of the speech. And so many things have happened since I dictated the speech earlier this week that I want to make a comment on those, and they're not covered in the speech. What more do I think we can do to win an honorable peace in Asia? Well, I think we should start doing what Ernest Greening and I have urged the Senate of the United States and the executive branch of government now for more than 2 years to do. I think we ought to keep faith with the great ideal and the great tenet that we profess, that we as a people, and I'm going to talk about America from the standpoint of her people, that we as a people live up to our ideals and practice this ideal For we created, prior to South Vietnam, the belief among millions of people in the world that we truly believe that there ought to be substituted for the law of the jungle and the use of the military claw as a device for settling disputes between nations, the rule of law. And that must never become a politician's platitude. That must become a way of peacekeeping in the world. In my judgment, if mankind is going to survive on anywhere near the level that we now exist and the higher levels that we can approach, if we'll substitute the rule of law for the jungle law of military might. But that means the United States, as well as every other nation, must keep faith with its own treaty commitments. And I get a great deal of criticism. I suppose this may be one of the reasons why the news was announced to me after I arrived in this auditorium this morning by the press that free speech has been banned by the Rochester, New York Board of Education, and that your speaker today, and I'm very happy that the platforms of this great university, and as far as I know, most universities in the country are still open. But apparently the story is that the Board of Education of Rochester refuses to allow the school auditorium to be used for a lecture of mine on October 10th. Although that afternoon I will be speaking at the University of Rochester. Academic freedom still prevails there, thank God. But isn't it interesting that because one holds to the point of view that I hold to, not asking for agreement but for thought, that there would be those in this country that want to impose a type of censorship that denies to the people of this country the right to at least listen to a point of view with which they may not agree? Well, they don't apparently like to hear me say that the sad but undeniable fact is that the United States government stands convicted, self-convicted before the world in violation of a whole series of treaty commitments to which our country has set its signature, or to which our country has said if our signature is not on the accord, such as the Geneva Accord, we will accept as setting forth rules of international law. My plea is that the United States proceed to live up to its commitment under the United Nations Charter, article after article, and find out what nations there are that do not want to substitute the rule of law for war in Southeast Asia. Now, Ernest Greening and I have made this suggestion now for over 2 years, and there's no denying that the Charter provides for it. There's no denying the fact, if you'll read the Charter, that when there's a threat to the peace of the world, that not only those who are participants, but those who are non-participants, but signatories to the Charter, have the treaty obligation, the international obligation to file before the Security Council a resolution calling upon the Security Council to proceed with its peacekeeping procedures to meet the threat to the peace of the world involved in that particular dispute. And we've openly defied that obligation. And we have some interesting limping alibis given to us by the State Department and the Department of Defense. The one most often given by the Department of State and by the Secretary of State is, well, we think that Russia and France would veto it. And I say, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary, why don't you find out? How do you know until you put them on the spot? And I happen to want to put Russia and France on the spot on this issue as to whether or not the peacekeeping obligations of the United Nations are to be used. But go ahead, Mr. Secretary, and read the rest of the Charter. If either one or both or some other country, because part of this limping excuse, as I said on the floor of the Senate yesterday afternoon when I was discussing another facet of this problem vis-a-vis India and Pakistan, another part of this limping excuse is that some of the non-permanent members of the Security Council prefer not to have the United States force the issue in the Security Council. And I say to the Secretary, so what? What's that got to do with the clear treaty obligation of this republic to take this issue to the rule of law and see what can be done to try to bring about an honorable peace in Asia. Who knows whether it can be done? I don't know. I don't claim to know the answers, but it's perfectly obvious, may I say, what our legal obligations are. It's very interesting, isn't it? That we're all for the Security Council taking jurisdiction over the war in India and Pakistan, and so was I. And I agree with Ambassador Goldberg in his statement yesterday. That's a great day for the United Nations. I agree that it was the clear obligation of the Security Council to call upon India and Pakistan for a ceasefire and make very clear that after they voluntarily asked for it in the first instance, that they intended, however, to back it up by an insistence if Pakistan and India made it necessary for United Nations enforcement. But I was keenly disappointed in what was omitted from the ambassador's speech yesterday before the United Nations General Assembly. I was keenly disappointed that Ambassador Goldberg was not authorized to announce to the world that we're ready now for the next step, and that the United States is now filing a formal resolution before the Security Council asking the Security Council also to take jurisdiction over a war being waged in Southeast Asia. Oh, but you say, Mr. Senator, is there really any hope that it might work? I don't know. I don't know. But I know we cannot morally or legally justify not trying it. I have some precedents. They're not too strong, but they're better than no precedents at all, as we lawyers say, and the State Department has none. The State Department doesn't have a single precedent on which it can stand in justification of its international outlawry. For let's face it, whether or not we like to admit it, in the eyes of hundreds of millions of people around the world, not only in the underdeveloped areas of the world, but in much of Western civilization too, the United States has convicted itself as an outlaw nation in Asia. And I would like to see us put this issue to the Security Council, and quickly. What are my precedents? Anyone in this room really think that there wouldn't have been a major war break out in the Middle East years ago if the United Nations had not taken jurisdiction over that threat to the peace and had not for many years past maintained a United Nations peacekeeping force on the Gaza Strip? Well, as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, let me say to you students that in my judgment, that's the only thing that stopped a major war in the Middle East. Anyone think that there wouldn't have broken out a major war in Africa over the Congo if the United Nations had not moved in? I think the United Nations should have stayed in greater depth a longer time and should be there in depth now. But at least we stopped a major war breaking out at that time because I was one of your delegates at the United Nations when that crisis existed. And that was the time, you remember, of the 15th General Assembly and the Khrushchev shoe-thumping assembly. And he came to New York fully expecting that the delegations from the new African nations would go down the line with him. And he got the shock of his political life. Those of us on the American delegation met daily with the delegates from many nations, including the delegates from the new African nations. And we were soon in a position to report back to our government that these African delegates stressed the point that they believed that the only thing that stood between them and a Russian takeover were the procedures of the United Nations. And they supported the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations in the Congo. And don't forget, Russia was already in with a small military force, but with several thousand poised to go into the Congo in a matter of days. We knew that she had about 1,000 troops already in, with thousands of more ready to go in. And after the United Nations took that jurisdiction, a courageous Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, said to Khrushchev, "Get out or the United Nations will put you out." You know what I think caused his change of mind more than anything else? The alignment of an overwhelming majority of the nations of the world, members of the United Nations. And the United Nations forces moved in and the Russian forces moved out. Well, my third precedent of any consequence at all, there are many other smaller precedents, but I want to mention these three large ones, is Cyprus. United Nations is in Cyprus. We don't know whether peace is going to be maintained or not. It's nip and tuck. But there's no doubt that if she hadn't gone in, there'd have been a major war in the Mediterranean long before this. And interestingly enough, a major war started by Greece and Turkey fighting each other, each side 100% equipped with American military aid. And I ask you, what kind of a moral position does that leave us in? In fact, the war between India and Pakistan was being fought with a 100% American equipment, to our disgrace as far as our contribution to that war is concerned. Well, of course there would have been a major war in the Mediterranean, but don't forget, your country and mine got kicked back into the United Nations over Cyprus. For your country and mine, along with Great Britain, were trying to get NATO to take jurisdiction over the trouble in Cyprus. I had no idea what was going on at the diplomatic level, but 10 days before Russia and France showed their hand, I took to the floor of the Senate and made a major speech in which I criticized my government's plans to try to get NATO to take jurisdiction in Cyprus, and pointed out that as a matter of international law, there wasn't a scintilla of right that justified either the United States or Great Britain seeking to have NATO move into the Cyprus. That it was a clear United Nations jurisdiction matter, and I shall always be proud to have my descendants read that discussion of international law that I made on the floor before I had any idea what was going on behind the world scenes. 10 days later, Russia and France disclosed their Trump hand. They disclosed that they had been busily at work lining up nation after nation around this world for a United Nations takeover of Cyprus. And the intelligence forces of CIA, the State Department, the Defense Department apparently were unaware of it, but that's not anything new for any one of the three. But when that became known, then your government changed its position, because the United States and Great Britain was then confronted with an organized world opinion in opposition to our position of trying to get NATO to come in. It was obvious to the world that we were trying to get NATO to come in because that would leave Russia out. And the sad fact is, you're not going to be able to hold world opinion unless you're willing to live up to the charter that you've signed, and that charter happens to contain the signatures of some communist nations as well as some free nations and other types of totalitarian nations as well. I'd like to see the ambassador of the United States to the United Nations receive instructions from his president to file the resolution. That's all it takes. I do not believe that there's any justification for so-called expedient negotiations behind the scenes in violation of an international law commitment. For I do not think that you can have a rule of law substituted for the law of the claw if you try to make exceptions to it. And we have to be willing to abide with our losses when we resort to an intellectual approach to these problems, as well as to our winnings. And we're going to lose when we find we cannot sustain our position as a matter of international law. Now let's assume the hypothetical that we follow that course of action. I think I should say, because you read a great many interesting stories, imaginative and fictional, I can assure you, in nature, about the relationship of your speaker this noon to the White House. Well, let me say that the President, of course, keenly disappointed that the senior senator from Oregon doesn't agree with his policies in Southeast Asia or in the Dominican Republic. But our relationships are close. There's a great respect between us. And we have a working arrangement, too, on foreign policy. It was not so long ago. In fact, the first memorandum was prepared just before he went to San Francisco for the United Nations meeting, and at his request, the President asked me to prepare a legal memorandum for him, setting forth my views in regard to the obligations of our country vis-a-vis the United Nations Charter. And I prepared it. He asked also that I have a second section in it making some suggestions as to what I thought he ought to say at San Francisco. I told him I'd be very glad to do that as an exercise on my part. But I did. I need not tell you that none of my recommendations in that section were followed. But he's just as honest and sincere in his thinking as I am, and is just as desirous, in my opinion, to obtain peace as I am. I just don't think that you're going to obtain peace, however, through the route that he is following. Well, following that, he called me to the White House and read an answer from his advisors to my memorandum. And the interesting thing is they did not quarrel with my legal findings. They didn't think my brief was pragmatic. Did you ever hear that argument before? When you can't answer an argument, you don't think that the argument is practical. And so I said, well, Mr. President, the question is whether or not it's legally sound. And the memorandum that they've given you admit its soundness. And I think we ought to start practicing it. But in their answer, they suggested that I prepare a second memorandum. I good-naturedly said, well, maybe this is the case, Mr. President, of putting the opposition to work. But I'll be very glad to prepare the second memorandum, setting forth a series of resolutions in the alternative that I thought we could submit to the Security Council, starting out with what I thought was the strongest one, which would ask for a complete jurisdictional takeover, ending up with a weaker one, which provided that at least the Security Council should be asked to call a United Nations conference on Southeast Asia, and through that conference proceed to take jurisdiction at a negotiating table. Because I digress very quickly to say, in my judgment, there can be no negotiations in Southeast Asia conducted by the United States. And there can be no successful negotiations in Southeast Asia controlled by the United States. We're going to win every major military engagement. We have the power to do so. I think we will level, if we continue this course of action, I think we will level most of the area where the Viet Cong are. I think they will be subdued, thousands of them killed. I think if they want to escalate it further, they can level North Vietnam and force upon them some kind of a surrender or a truce. But that'll provide no victory. That'll provide no peace. For decades, and note my time limit, as I said to the press before I came to the auditorium, for decades, the United States will have to maintain a large military force in Asia to enforce any temporary settlement that we're able to force out of the Vietnamese, Viet Cong, and North Vietnamese by way of our military power. We must learn. And I don't think the American people are ready to face it yet. And I think voices such as mine must expect to be criticized and castigated for the time being, because our flag is being waved into tatters, and that's no way to pay respect to the flag. It's being waved in tatters by those who seem to think that you got to fight communism sometime, anytime, anyway, and this is the time to fight it in Asia. And as I have said so many times on the floor of the Senate, including just yesterday afternoon, in my judgment, this military course of action is making communists by the hundreds of thousands around the world. Because what we don't seem to want to appreciate is the fact that the yellow races are now going to be convinced, either emotionally or intellectually, it doesn't make any difference. They're going to be convinced that the white man represented by the United States seeks to maintain a foothold of domination in Asia. And as I say in the manuscript, I consider that hopeless. It's never going to occur. They've already driven out of Asia most Western powers. Certainly the British and the French and the Dutch and the Belgians have known and have learned. Asia is for the Asians. Oh, we talk about we're in South Vietnam, and this is going to be brought out at a negotiating table if it's under the auspices of the United Nations. If you're going to have these negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations, don't think that every session is going to be a session complimentary to the United States, for we have much to answer for. And when these negotiations, if they're conducted by the United Nations, are finally terminated, we're going to be held to an accounting for a good many of our transgressions. But we too have to be willing to stand with a judgment that goes against us in some respects. But the important thing is that we insist that these issues that threaten the peace of the world be settled by way of judgments and not by way of bullets. Well, what are some of our transgressions? Have you ever read the Geneva Accords? I'm always so interested in reading editorials from some editors about the Geneva Accords, and the editorials leave great question in my mind as to whether or not they ever read the Geneva Accords. Let me take you back to 1954 for a moment. We had the Geneva meeting. John Foster Dulles represented the United States for a time. When he couldn't accomplish what his major objective was, he packed his satchel and went back to Washington and left Bedell Smith there as an observer. For John Foster Dulles was greatly disturbed that the French were going to move out of Indochina. He, by negotiations with Churchill, had attempted to get Great Britain to join with us in asking France to stay in on the basis of a commitment of British and American troops. And Churchill turned him down. It's a matter of recorded history. And the idea was that if Churchill would accept, they'd go across the Channel and make their pledge to the French government, pledging the troops, and then it would be announced to the Congress. And the record shows Churchill turned it down on its merits, and he also turned it down with his question to the American Secretary of State, "Don't you think, Mr. Secretary, that would be deceiving the Congress of the United States?" That's what you call secret diplomacy carried through to an accomplished fact. And then they come before the Congress and say, "Oh, this was such a difficult agreement to reach, you must now not let us down." Time and time again in the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, my years of service there, I've listened to the Secretary of State or his aides, the Secretary of Defense or his aides, pleading that we underwrite an agreement that they'd entered into without our knowledge in advance, on the ground that we'd lose great face and prestige if we didn't back up their agreement. You know what it's based on? It's based on a great fallacy that many people, and I suspect even many in this room, have come to accept. A dogma, a complete fallacy that foreign policy in the United States belongs to the President of the United States and the Secretary of State. Where did we ever get that idea under our Constitution? Foreign policy does not belong to the President or his Secretary of State. Foreign policy belongs to the people of this country, and you must constantly make a people's foreign policy. And under our Constitution, all the President and Commander-in-Chief is the administrator of a people's foreign policy. One of my major criticisms of American foreign policy is that too much of it is arrived at by secret diplomacy and announced after the accomplishment of the fact. And you can't improve upon Wilson's great tenet of open covenants openly arrived at in regard to foreign policy. And there's another phase of foreign policy that I want you to keep in mind and answer a fallacy connected with that. The argument that Congress, after all, does not have a voice in American foreign policy. Reread your Constitution. Article after article of that Constitution, or section after section dealing with the powers of Congress, leaves no room for doubt that Congress is vested with a checking power upon a foreign policy recommended by the President of the United States. Why, the President can't move in a matter of foreign policy without an authorization bill. And what do we mean by an authorization bill? Just what it says. That the program recommended must be authorized by an authorization act, and recommendations made for funds for that act. And the second check is your appropriation act. And he has no power except in terms of the money that is financed, that is given to finance the program. You know what I want to stress at this point, and have you remember from this lecture? Don't you ever let become a truism this precious guarantee of your freedom of maintaining a system of government based upon three coordinate and co-equal branches of government. It's become almost a politician's platitude. But it involves the precious safeguard as to whether or not you are going to be protected from the ultimate development of a government of executive supremacy in this republic. And you're further down the road toward a government by executive supremacy than you realize, because you have been served by a Congress in recent years that has been delegating away check after check after check of your precious rights to see to it that Congress does not give rubber stamp carte blanche authority to a President of the United States and his cabinet. Sit with me and listen to the testimony in connection, for example, with a foreign aid bill. Let me tell you that an overwhelming majority of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, in the Senate hearings and the markup on the bill, disapprove of the bill in its present form. But they wouldn't vote that way. Very interesting that yesterday the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Fulbright, wouldn't even vote on the appropriations bill for foreign aid, asked to be excused from voting and authorized to vote present, and stood up as you have to under the rules of the Senate and gave his reasons for voting present. And he voted present because he can't approve of the bill in its present form, because there was eliminated from it the Morse Amendment and the Fulbright Amendment. The Morse Amendment, which would bring to an end the foreign aid program by fiscal 67 and start a new foreign aid program all over again on greatly different premises. And the Fulbright Amendment, which would authorize a bill for only 2 years, while the commission called for by my amendment would make an analysis in depth of the abuses of foreign aid and recommend a new foreign aid program. You see, the trouble is that most of the people that are defending foreign aid know very little about its abuses. You can't have made available to you the Comptroller General's reports on foreign aid. Let me say that I follow a little debating strategy each year on foreign aid, in which I walk on the floor of the Senate with the Comptroller General's devastating criticisms of foreign aid in report after report, and I take in a ruler and I measure the increasing height of them year by year. And this year they got over 24 inches high. Of course, you know you want to expect to be charged with demagoguery when you do that, but I call it dramatic emphasis. And each report marks secret and confidential. You, the people, cannot be told what's in those reports. What I've said to the Senate, you can read them. When they leave my desk, they'll go back to the vaults of the Foreign Relations Committee, go down and read them. And if you'll read them, you find your own agent, the Comptroller General, has pointed out the hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars of waste and inefficiency. Yes, the cause of corruption within the governments of a shocking number of the governments of the underdeveloped countries of the world. And your speaker has been pleading for a revision of that practice in American foreign policy, as he's pleading for a revision of our policy in regard to Southeast Asia. Very quickly, let me point out that the Geneva Accords, which we said we would respect as international law, literally forbade the shipment into South Vietnam of every tank, every gun, every airplane, every American soldier that we've put into South Vietnam. We stand in open violation of the Geneva Accords from the very beginning. And so do the Viet Cong, and so do the North Vietnamese, and in my judgment, so do the Red Chinese. But what an argument that we can justify being an outlaw nation because someone else is committing a wrong, when the Charter says when you find the wrong being committed by the North Vietnamese and the Red Chinese and the Viet Cong, take them immediately to the Security Council. Oh, don't tell me that because they don't belong to the United Nations Charter, you don't have jurisdiction. Read the Charter. The signatories to the Charter bind themselves to enforce the peace, not only when a threat of peace arises between members of the Charter, but where a threat to the peace involves any nation anywhere in the world. We ought to have sat with me on the Foreign Relations Committee in 1956 when the plans were approved, with some of us voicing a vigorous protest to squelch the elections called for by the Geneva Accords in 1956, for a plebiscite, for a determination by the people as to whether or not they were going to unite the two zones. For remember, the Geneva Accords did not set up a government in South Vietnam. The Geneva Accords never provided for a government in South Vietnam, but a zone. And all that 17th parallel is but a marcation line between two zones. But the United States decided, and our intelligence reports showed, that in South Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh would receive 80% minimum of the vote. And that meant, of course, the overthrow of our puppet, Diem. And where'd he come from? That first American puppet was a South Vietnamese exile in New York City and Washington, D.C. And our CA and our war hawks decided to make him our favorite puppet, and we took him to South Vietnam. We militarized him, we financed him, and when he failed, we moved into another puppet, and then another puppet, and then another puppet. And we talk about supporting freedom in South Vietnam. There has never been an hour of governmental freedom in South Vietnam because we have never set up a government that believes in freedom. We have supported one military tyrant after another. Well, this committee here will be pulling my coattail. That's what happens when you leave manuscript, but I wanted to make one final point. I want to say that you can't look at Southeast Asia alone. You've got to look at American foreign policy around the world. And one of the reasons that our image in South America is badly tarnished is that the mass of the people in many a South American country have grave doubts about our international sincerity as they view our course of action in Vietnam. And the House of Representatives this week struck a body blow to American foreign policy in South America. May I say, as chairman of the subcommittee of Latin America in the Senate, out of whose committee the Alliance for Progress program came when Jack Kennedy was a member of my committee. And when I made the motion and he seconded the motion to have that series of research studies made, with $150,000 that the Senate appropriated to my committee to try to find out what had happened to the American image in South America in 1958. And we entered into those contracts on the basis of that motion. supported by an eloquent speech by Jack Kennedy, contracts with universities and research foundations and recognized Latin American scholars in the United States, told them to find the facts, make recommendations as to what congressional and governmental policy should be. For I said, as politicians, we're not qualified to make the study ourselves. We're not expert. But we ought to be qualified, or we have no right to sit here as legislative jurors to pass judgment upon the recommendations that such experts will make. They made the studies. I've sat in the office of one Latin American president after another since, always finding the studies there, and always hearing each president say, in his own language form, I want you to know, Mr. Senator, those studies serve as the basis of the reforms that I'm advocating in my country. And Jack Kennedy took those studies to the White House. And as he told you at the time, every segment of the Alliance for Progress program is based upon the recommendations taken from those studies. But that study is a study that seeks to export to Latin America economic freedom so that political freedom can be developed by the people themselves. You cannot export political freedom. We make a great mistake in American policy. For 50 years, we've tried to export political freedom, and you know the vehicles we use to export it in? Military aid and military might. And all that is doing is weakening the hands of our free governments in Latin America and playing into the hands of military oligarchs and the House of Representatives. By that unfortunate resolution that it passed this year, has weakened us not only in Latin America, but it has frightened people around the world. For what that resolution means is the United States will support any country in Latin America or doing it on our own to move in militarily if a country decides or we decides that some country is threatened with communism. You can't beat communism that way. I close by saying, you know how you have to beat communism? Here, in this hemisphere, in Southeast Asia and everywhere else, you have to do those things that will make people economically free. You'll have to raise the standard of living of the masses of the world who couldn't care less about anything than our talk about political freedom, and yet it's so vital to their long-time survival. But you're going to have to evolve it, grow it out of the seed beds of economic freedom. And so you hear me say frequently in the Senate, we've got to export bread, not bullets. We've got to recognize that in any Latin American country or anywhere else, you give me a society of people with family farm ownership, with farms large enough to support the farmer and his family in health and decency. You give me private home ownership in the city, and of course that means real estate reforms, interest reforms, tax reforms, money reforms. And then you give me employment at wages high enough to support the family of the wage earner in health and decency, and I'll give you a society of people in which communism doesn't have a chance. But you give me a society in Latin America or anywhere else, controlled by a military junta, backed up by American planes and tanks and machine guns and artillery, and I'll give you a society that in the long run is doomed, because the yearning for freedom is inherent in the breast of all human beings, irrespective of the color of their skin. And I'd have my country learn before it is too late that the United States cannot dictate the political forms of the countries in the underdeveloped areas of the world. But the United States, through economic freedom, can help make them politically free through their own effort. I close by saying I think I've demonstrated I came not asking for agreement but for thought. And I leave you with a challenge. It's your foreign policy, and you better start making it your most important business. Thank you very much.
There will be a brief... There will be a brief intermission before we start our question and answer period.
Water there?
Yes, I'd like to look.
We have a special guest with us today, Mr. Allen, and he will begin the question and answer period. Mr. Allen?
Thank you. Senator, I, for one, am somewhat encouraged in the middle of my general discouragement about Vietnam by the gradual evolution of the administration's position and the gradual, to my view, civilization of it. Do you think I am over-encouraged by this trend, or do you think there is perhaps a hopelessly wide gulf between the two general positions?
Well, before I answer the question, let me say, Mr. Allen, and I no one ever accuses me of flattery. It's a great honor for me to have you here, and a particular honor to have you start the question period. I too am encouraged over what my state of mind was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, you couldn't get any consideration of a United Nations approach and discussion with administration leaders. Then, when Congress reconvened this January, a very dramatic thing happened in the Foreign Relations Committee with the first visitation of the Secretary of State, because the year before, I was a pretty lonely voice in the Foreign Relations Committee with a few friendly questions being asked from time to time by maximum of 4 others of my colleagues. But when the final votes were taken, I was alone. Then on the floor of the Senate, I had the support of Ernest Greening. And at that time, there was apparently no interest in the Foreign Relations Committee about a United Nations approach. And Congress adjourned and the senators went home. When we came back to the first meeting, one senator, whose name as a matter of protocol has to remain unmentioned, who had been a strong supporter of the administration's policy in Vietnam, went right after the Secretary of State and wanted to know why he didn't have any program for taking this matter to the United Nations. And immediately the chairman of the committee moved in. And I didn't have to ask a question. I asked some, but I wouldn't have had to ask any. For 2 hours and a half, the Secretary of State was bombarded with questions showing that something had happened in the Foreign Relations Committee. And from that time on, we started getting at least some consultations and some conferences on various possible negotiating settlements. And when the meeting was over, I said to this first questioner, I said, "What's happened to you?" He said, "I've been home." They went home. And they found that at the grassroots of America, although there is a desire to support our president, and I want to support my president, there's a desire to support him, there's a greater desire for this president and his advisors to find a way out of making war in South Vietnam by resorting to the peacekeeping procedures that are available. I often get criticized wanting to get out of South Vietnam. I haven't said we should get out, but I said others should come in, and on an entirely different basis than we're in on. One of enforcing a peace rather than making war. And if we could get a good many other nations to come in on that basis, then I think there's some hope of reaching an honorable settlement. But you're quite right with the very fact that the president would ask me for the memoranda that he asked me for. You don't quote the president. But let me say the fact that the President has discussed this matter with me and has had the Secretary of State at his request discuss the memoranda with him, has asked that Ambassador Goldberg discuss this matter with those of us that believe that we ought to resort to international law procedures. And I am particularly pleased, may I say, with the appointment of Ambassador Goldberg. He's demonstrated already, and he's a tough negotiator and a very, very intelligent man. He's demonstrated already that he's doing what he can, at least, to elicit an interest in the United Nations short of filing a resolution. Now, I'm very impersonal about this. I made a speech yesterday afternoon. It'll be interpreted by some as critical of the ambassador. Well, it's critical in the sense that I think he ought to be insisting on the filing of a resolution. But I highly praise him for what I know he's doing in his conversations with youth and with the delegates from other nations, both free and communist, in trying to arouse a United Nations interest. I hope that in the not too distant future we can at least get our country to call for an official United Nations conference on Vietnam. You know what I think that'll lead to? I think once you get them down, coming to grips officially with the problem, you'll then get support for a ceasefire. That's the first thing you got to have. You can't negotiate while bombing is going on. Get a ceasefire, but get a table set up, and I'll close with this. Get a table set up where the United States and the South Vietnamese are on one side, and the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese and Red China, if she wants to sit on the other side, and the United Nations representatives at the head of the table. That's what you got to do.
I must ask before we begin questioning that the questions please be short and to the point. The gentleman with the paper.
Senator, a few weeks ago, Morley Safer of the CBS report from Vietnam showed American soldiers walking with cigarette lighters in their hands and burning houses from which emerged children and women. 2 weeks ago, Norman Cousins in Saturday Review stated that this was ordered from higher authorities and that this order is still on the books. Could you tell us whether this inhumane order is still on the books or what is your thought about it?
No, I cannot advise you as to what the war-making policies are in Vietnam. First, because I don't know enough about it to advise you reliably, and second, on the basis of what I do know, I just must tell you my lips are sealed. As long as I sit in the Foreign Relations Committee and in the Senate of the United States, I have the clear ethical duty of following the rules of secrecy. I have been pleading since 1946 for the lifting of most of these rules of secrecy. I do not believe, and I served for a while on the Armed Services Committee and now on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I want to say that in my 20 years in the Senate, at least 85% of the material that we've been allowed to see, and there's much that we as senators are not allowed to see, but at least 85% of the material that we've been allowed to see marked top secret, never should have the label top secret on it at all, belongs to you, the people. And they use the top secret label in order to make it impossible for us to discuss it with you. But that just happens to be the rule. But I know what your question implies, and so I can discuss it from this angle, that in my judgment, I'm exceedingly disappointed on the reports that I have received in regard to some of the war tactics that are being followed in Southeast Asia on both sides. It's a war of great terror, of great atrocity, great brutality, and I think it ought to be cleaned up if the other nations of the world would start insisting that at least some of the articles of war be enforced. I'm very sorry that there is no record to date of our official petition for international action against violations of articles of war in South Vietnam, and they have been violated by the Viet Cong, and they've been violated by the Vietnamese, and I wish that we weren't involved as accessories. Next question.
The gentleman, sir.
The question is, do I believe that Red China should become a member of the UN? That's in my manuscript, but let me summarize it by saying, as a delegate in 1960, I joined with a unanimous American delegation in voting against the ceding of Red China. If I were a delegate this year, I would vote against her ceding again, but I would see if we couldn't move faster on what our proposal was in 1960. I happen to believe that the issue of Red China is basically a United Nations issue and not a United States issue. And I think that Red China should be voted into the United Nations whenever we can work out with her whenever the United Nations can work out with her some conditions precedent, some commitments before the fact that give us reason to believe that she will abide by the Charter. And so in 1960, your delegation, and I was proud to play a hand in that, urged that the United Nations set up a committee or a commission to proceed with some negotiations with Red China aimed at leading to her being admitted to the United Nations if she'd make such commitments as we had in mind, to wit as follows. Here you have Red China. The very moment that I speak, or up to the moment I speak, continues to say that she intends to make war over Formosa whenever she's strong enough to do it. Well, making war over Formosa can't be reconciled with the commitment of a signer of that treaty that she won't make war. Now, the question of the sovereignty of Formosa is yet to be determined. No nation really has sovereign rights over Formosa as a matter of international law. The last country that had sovereign rights under international law over Formosa was Japan. She got them by conquest. It's still possible to get sovereign rights by conquest. But remember, we made very clear that we would not take territory by conquest. We would not take sovereignty by conquest. And what we inherited by agreement of the Allies, including Russia at the time, was a caretaker obligation in the Pacific, including Formosa. And in 1955, Herbert Lehman and I led the fight against the Formosa Doctrine with the Morse-Lehman substitute, in which we proposed that there be substituted for the doctrine a United Nations trusteeship over Formosa, to be held for as many years as it would take for an ultimate determination of this question of sovereignty of Formosa, not forgetting the rights of some 7 to 10 million native Formosans who are not national Chinese. We were defeated, and in our caretaker capacity, the Congress went along with the Formosa Resolution, where, when all is said and done, Chiang Kai-shek operates really under that caretaker resolution. Now, I think that Red China ought to make a commitment that she's not going to make war over Formosa, but there ought to also be a commitment that eventually the question of the sovereignty of Formosa will be determined by juridical processes. As I speak here this afternoon, Red China stands in open violation of article after article of the Korean Truce. I don't know how you can justify voting her into the United Nations until you get some commitments out of her in regard to that truce. Let me name one more, and I could go on and name 20, but I want to name one more. You know what disturbs many people in our country and disturbs me? It disturbs many people in other countries where their nationals are also languishing in Chinese prisons. It's whether or not these Americans and others that are imprisoned were really spies, were really guilty of espionage, or whether they were thrown in prison in violation of the only one principle of international law that I know is applicable to this situation involving these words of art. We have a right not to interfere in the enforcement of domestic law in China, but every nation has a right under international law to have determined whether or not a country in its imprisoning policies violates the principles of civilized law. Those are the words of art. So I suggested, or our delegation suggested in 1960, that if you could have United Nations conversations with Red China over the question of her admission, a suggestion ought to be made that she give consideration to having the World Court or some other international judicial body appoint a review commission to go into Red China and determine in an examination of these cases whether or not this principle of violating the rules of civilized law had been violated. There are many others that I could mention, but now I come to the hardest part of it. Let's assume the hypothetical that she just refuses to make any commitments in advance. Let's face it, she's got to be voted in eventually, in spite of us. She got a new vote recently in Singapore. Singapore's now an independent nation. The head of that government, Mr. Lee, evidenced over and over again that he's a bitter anti-American leader. He's going to cooperate with Sir Colonel. I think eventually she's going to be voted in. Until you can get commitments, I think we ought to continue to stress the principle that I'm urging. Many of my liberal friends and many liberal organizations bitterly criticize me for this position, but as I told you, I've got to look at the facts and decide what I think is in the best public interest. Now, the toughest thing in connection with the whole matter, whether she's voted in or isn't voted in, she eventually is going to be a nuclear power. Now, I'm greatly concerned. You don't like to hear me say so, but I tell you, I'm completely convinced of it. We have those, particularly within our Pentagon building, on the theory that you're going to have to fight China sooner or later, and you might as well do it now. We would like to see us bomb out the Chinese nuclear installations. We can do it. We can do it. But they'll be rebuilt 25, 50 years from now. They're going to be rebuilt. But they'll be rebuilt not only on foundations of materiality, they'll be built on a foundation of hatred and desire for revenge against future generations of American boys and girls, unbelievable in its depth. I don't want to leave that legacy to my great-great-grandchildren and yours. We can win a war against Red China now, as the militarists use the term of winning a war, but we'll never win the peace. And I thought our objective was to try to set up a world order in which we would battle out our differences of opinion in an intellectual forum and not on a battlefield. You just happen to have reached that era of military development in which no peace can ever again be won through war. And let me say, it's appropriate for me to say it, our government knows you can't beat China by air power, nuclear or conventional. They know that you can destroy the nuclear installations. We can destroy her cities. We can destroy such industrial complexes she has. We can kill millions of her people. And to even think that we're talking about it is shocking, but we can do it. But they also know that to control China and really beat her militarily, you're going to have to meet her on the ground. Where do you suppose the 300,000 figure came from? It was when Senate faces turned white at a briefing in which they were advised that it would be necessary, if China moved on the ground, to be ready to start to meet her with 300,000. And as Hans Morgenthau of the University of Chicago said, and he's forgotten more about Asia than McNamara and Rusk will ever know, as he said, 300,000, it'll be no time before you'll have to have 3 million. And when you get 3 million over there to exercise the controls, you'll be there for years. And I happen to be one who doesn't believe we have either the manpower or the economic power to enforce that kind of a military victory. And that's why I think if you want to talk about our best selfish interest from the standpoint of manpower in our economy, you ought to urge that at least we try, make an approach some of us are urging through the international councils of the world rather than through military power. Next question.
I have only time for one more question.
A little louder, I beg your pardon. Well, if I understand the question, it's a general question, is what do I think about the situation between Pakistan and India, and also the Chinese participation in regard to it. Well, I got many thoughts on it, but let me say very quickly that I'm sorry that we have not exercised or tried to exercise a greater influence in recent years in the United Nations over the Kashmir issue and between India and Pakistan. Let's face it. It has been very major in the cause of the present outburst between the two countries. We have a great American by the name of Frank Graham. He used to be a senator from North Carolina. For years was president of the University of North Carolina, was the special United Nations representative over a period of years trying to negotiate a settlement between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. I said to the American ambassador, Ambassador Goldberg, and to the Secretary of State just the other day, I wish you would get out the Graham reports, which are secret, and I wish you'd get him in for a conference, because I think the United Nations must do what, and it was interesting to hear him say it yesterday, Ambassador Goldberg said yesterday, they must move now into the Kashmir issue. I think the United Nations must make very clear to both India and to Pakistan that the Kashmir issue has got to be settled on a peaceful basis. And it's not for me, I don't know enough about it to intelligently recommend, it's not for me to say what the terms of that agreement should be. But I do think that the United Nations must say to both countries they must reach an agreement under the auspices of the United Nations. As to China, great dispute as to what the border difficulty is between India and China. It's very difficult to negotiate a settlement between India and China. With China, may I say to the questioner, outside of the United Nations, and with China taking the very adamant position that she takes. But I think the United Nations must make very clear to China that it will see to it that she's not going to be allowed to march into India, that she will maintain whatever forces are necessary to keep the peace. That's a different thing than making war, but that she will use whatever force is necessary to prevent a Chinese invasion if China decides to march into India. Next question.
Excuse me, unfortunately our time is limited, and therefore I'm going to have to call a halt to our question and answer period. And at this time I would like to thank the Senator for appearing on behalf of the Associated Student Speakers Program.
Thank you very much.